All right. So three, two, one. Hey, I'm Larry Flick,
I'm Gabe Scherzer.
and this is the comment section where all the best conversation happens. It can get a little ruthless,
Oh, and it will.
but it's always fun. It's always fun, and we're really delighted you're joining us today. As two music nerds, two rock nerds, we invite you to the first of what will be a series of conversations about our favorite bands from different decades, different eras of music. And like every one that we've done so far, every kind of countdown we've done so far, top threes, there are usual common grounds, but there's a lot of differences in our tastes. And I don't know if it's funny. I don't know, Gabe. At first, I thought the differences were going to be age related, but I don't think so. I think you actually have a much more old school feel than I do, and you are considerably younger than I am. What do you think? What do you think it's all
It,
about?
I mean, I'm just a freak, I think, at the end of the day.
I
I mean, I would say you probably have more knowledge of pop music than I do. I just
know, but you definitely go deeper in some ways than I do. It's just a different approach, but I think it works. I think it works. So, this was your idea
Yeah.
to start here. So, lead us into the fray, shall
Yeah.
you?
So today, Larry, we are talking about bands from the 60s, which, I was just a wee little boy at that time. But
A wee little boy. I think your parents were wee little children back in the 60s.
well, I rather should say that maybe in another life I was born then, because I've always really had a deep connection and sort of draw towards bands that came out of 60s into the 70s. I'm a psychedelic rock guy at heart. I'm a blues guy at heart, and really I'm just a rock and roll guy at heart. So I mean, this is I'm excited for this one. I'm excited.
I am too. I was born in 1963. Um, and I think I've mentioned in the past that my parents were 18 when they got married and decided to have a family. So, this is very much, and they were, even though neither of them had any kind of musical aptitude, they were both deep music fans. And my dad was a rocker, my mom was a pop and soul girl. And so I was exposed to all these bands seemingly from birth. And I will say that, as you know, I will find things about every decade to be deeply passionate about. But when I was thinking about this conversation we were going to have today, I kept thinking, oh my God, some of the most important bands in history formed during the 60s. Some of the bands that kind of really shaped my passion for music were born in the 60s. So I'm stoked.
So
I'm stoked. So who?
so
Go
before
on.
before we dive into our lists, I think that it might be fun to talk a little bit about why, you could say that every decade of music has, there are really important players that come about in each decade. But I think we can fairly say that the 60s was sort of in a league of its own in the birthing of all of these iconic bands that we're still talking about to this day. Obviously, it was an incredibly volatile and incredibly difficult time for a lot of people. And I'm wondering if do you think that the genre of rock and roll, do you think it was like a sort of pressure makes the diamond situation, in that people were sort of begging for people to speak out? Or do you just think that people couldn't, that these musicians really just had so much to say?
I think it was a perfect storm, because many people will reach back to the 50s as the birth of American rock and roll, right? Bill Haley, Rock Around the Clock, Chubby Checker, all of that. Elvis, Elvis was 60s, wasn't he? But really, the 50s were a really important time for the birthing of rock. But rock, like all the other genres of music in the times leading up to the 50s, were not as aggressively, from my point of view, not as aggressively reflective of the times. Because, soul music, blues music, R&B music, jazz music, pop standards were much more either rooted in romance, relationships, or relief from the hard times. The 60s is when someone said, we have this art form and we're attracted to it because it can be whatever we want it to be. The whole essence of rock and roll is freedom and flexibility and being different. And I think the turmoil of the 60s, the political strife, the sexual awakening of the nation, the initial birthing of the women's movement, all of these different things drew artists out in expressing in music in a way that they never thought that they could. So if you look at like some of the bands that we're going to talk about, and some of the bands even that we'll wind up mentioning on the back end as honorable mentions, they reflect the fact that they were using craft and art for relief. There was still the flip side of that, where you had like bubblegum pop and funk music and all of those things, and they were there to reflect, romance and sexual tension and provide party-like relief. But rock and roll was very much a perfect storm of art meeting with the political, financial, and sexual times, and young artists who were seizing the opportunity, who were suddenly recognizing that this was a new way to express themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think? What do you think? As someone who's studied this art form, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with everything you said. I would add that, I think that with the civil rights movement, and, all the attention that came with that, rightfully so, I think another thing that you started seeing was that you started getting a lot more attention was being placed on these Black artists, but also what you had in the decades leading up, you had white artists who sort of didn't really want to touch the kind of content or the kind of styles that Black artists and Black bands were creating. And what you had in the 60s was, I think sort of a realization of, oh, this is fucking awesome. I should be doing this. And so you sort of had that fear of the unknown and that underlying desire to not want to be making the same kind of content. You sort of had that start to go down a little bit. You had more bands that were really taking influence and, seeing, oh, this music is amazing. I want to make it. People are resonating with it for a reason. I really think that there was just this moment of what are we doing here? There are so many sounds that Black musicians have been using for years and years that we've just been too afraid to do. What? Because it's different. And I think that it led to some phenomenal music, both from Black artists and from white artists.
I think you're absolutely right. So let's begin.
Yeah, after you, my friend.
Yes. I'm going to begin with a band and a record that I hadn't listened to in a really long time. And in kind of preparation for our conversation today, I went back and listened to it, and I was astonished how every song on this record by this band gave me chills. And it's the self-titled debut by Crosby, Stills, and Nash, starting with the 7.5-minute Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, which was just and still is a masterclass in harmony, rhythm, and storytelling. And the thing that made, I mean, there was a period of time when it was Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young, the Young being Neil Young. But the for me, this band was always best when it was just David Crosby, Stephen Stills, and Graham Nash. There were times when I thought that they were distracted by, the indulgences of Neil Young when he was part of the band. He did great stuff with them, but I thought they were at their best when it was the three of them. They had, incomparable harmonies and just, every single song they ever sang was both romantic and politically aware and smart. And it started with that 1969 self-titled debut, which is a perfect album. It is a perfect album. There is not one song that doesn't land, whether it be, Guinevere, Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, like I said, which was written about Judy Collins, the singer-songwriter, whom Stephen Stills was dating at the time. They also represented this world that I, seemingly from birth, was fascinated by, which was the Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco music scene. I was born in New York. I was born in the Bronx. I was raised in concrete, in gray. Buses and subways and all that nonsense. And seemingly from birth, I craved the opposite. And I daydreamed about the day that I would be able to be in a place like California, particularly San Francisco. And they represented that world perfectly. So my number 3 is Crosby, Stills, and Nash.
Great, you brought up the Haight-Ashbury area, and I mean that's where I really got my start for rock and roll, was with the Grateful Dead. And I mean that's their home right there, and that's the attitude of I don't really care what anyone else says. I don't really care if they think we're playing too long. I don't care if they think that the music doesn't work. We're going to do it because we love it and because we know that other people will connect to it.
Yeah.
And that's the rock and roll attitude,
I love it.
So my number 3 is the band Cream. And
love Cream.
Obviously the legend himself, Mr. Eric Clapton. You've got Jack Bruce and you've got Ginger Baker. And, rest in peace, Ginger Baker. This band is, I would quite possibly the tightest band I've ever heard play. They were not only, so in sync collectively, but individually, they all knew exactly when to take their moment to shine, which I would say probably is what drew Eric Clapton to be a solo artist, because he wanted that more time to shine. But I mean, it was really the first trio that made me feel like I was floating, with such minimal instrumentation, with such minimal seemingly effort. They could make just sort of a world of sonic expression that always just blows my mind. And, I was talking about sort of Black music influencing. I mean, this was exhibit A, you know, for me. This was, look at all of these sounds and all of this soul and this style that we can make with just a couple of instruments and a good song or two. And you know, I think it was really, it made Clapton hungrier, which led to some of his best music. I think that he wanted to be known as his own person, which for better or for worse, he did. And I mean, it just astounds me to watch old clips of these guys playing, and, you know, it's talking without talking. And that's my favorite thing that happens during a live performance. So I'm going with Cream as my number one. I mean, sorry, as my number three.
I love Cream. And as much as I've said previously that I've always been kind of like hot and cold on Eric Clapton, his Cream era was unlike any other I ever heard. And my father had, because I was, how old was I? I was 4 years old when Disraeli Gears came out. And I remember my father, I mean, I have a faint memory of my father buying it, a very faint memory of my father buying it. It was one of his favorite albums of all time. So it was like a constant in our household as I got older. And to me, the perfect 1-2 punch of songs on any rock record from that era was Strange Brew going into Sunshine of Your Love. It just hairs on your arms standing up, so good. And you know, I mean, to me, Strange Brew was like, you know, forbidding but seductive and a little scary, you know. And then Sunshine of Your Love just kind of felt like the air coming into the room, the windows opening, and it was just like, I just love. Oh, yes.
So Larry,
yes, give me more.
Let me ask you this: Do you think what makes and what made at least a great rock record in the '60s was this beautiful blend between familiarity and sort of the unknown? It was, here's one thing or a couple of aspects that, you know, you've seen, you've heard. It's something that you can grab onto. It's a lifeline, you know what I mean? And then also we're gonna drop in some shit that you have never heard before, and you're not even gonna know that you like it until you hear it.
Well, yeah, I absolutely, yes, 100%, because this was still the earliest days of rock and roll, so that not every trope had been done and retread and reimagined, so that on something like Disraeli Gears by Cream or the Crosby, Stills and Nash album that we talked about a few minutes ago, there were things going on those records that had not been done yet because they hadn't been invented yet, or they hadn't been put in that kind of context, right? There's a lot of vintage blues all over a Cream record. There's a lot of vintage folk music all over a Crosby, Stills and Nash record. But neither of those bands ever put what they did on those albums. No other band had done what they put on those albums in that kind of context musically. So it became both thrilling and a little frightening. And when I say frightening, I don't mean like, ooh, someone's going to get me, but just kind of like the unknown was truly happening in front of us. And that was, you know, we'll never experience it again unless there's this like change in, you know, unless there are further changes in technology that allow for new sounds that we haven't heard before. This is when the sounds were being formulated in a way that was so compelling that people to this day are replicating.
Yeah, they were setting the bar. I mean, they were.
Yes,
it's what they were doing.
Yes, without question. All right, so my number two is a band that was formed in 1964. They went on till 1996, but in various forms, and that was the Velvet Underground. And I love the Velvet Underground for a variety of reasons. I think they represented the grime and the poetry of New York and the New York beat scene, the birth of the punk scene, the beginning of this, this creative and emotional war between John Cale and Lou Reed, and the fact that you could choose between a John Cale song which had a beautiful tenor vocal, or Lou Reed, which was, listen, Lou Reed's one of my favorite rock artists in history of all time. Not a great singer, really, and more of a stylist. And they really explored the influence of drugs in life and in music. They played with. They tried to play with blues. I don't know that they did that very well, but they were just, so many of the rules that had already been formed in the early 60s were thrown out by the time they had really hit their stride. They started in 64. They really didn't hit their stride till in the late 60s and really became a big band during the 70s. But those early records were just chaos. And, as much as I love pop music and as much as I love classic song structure, I also love a bit of anarchy. And to me, they were and will always be the ultimate anarchists of music. And they didn't do it by breaking their guitars. They did it by playing their music honestly and being willing to not always sound pretty along the way. And I kind of like that. They were just, I could never take my eyes and ears off of them. Never could. So Velvet Underground, my number 2.
Yeah, and I love what you said about not only taking your ears off, but taking your eyes, because I think the 60s was such an expressive time, not only for music, but for musical performance, right? I mean, you have all these people, these brilliant musicians who really see the value in a way that I don't know if exists anymore amongst modern artists, except for maybe a few, of putting on a show, and that really being the main attraction, as sort of a record being the pathway to the live shows as opposed to the other way around. Do you think that's a fair analysis?
I think that's completely fair. I think it's completely accurate, because they were very much part of the art scene in New York City. They were very much a part of Warhol. If you go back to 1967 and you listen to Venus and Furs or Heroin, they sound great on record,
mm-hmm.
but they come to life in concert. They came to life in concert, without question. Yeah, I mean, they were very much an event happening. Back in the 60s, one of the big theater movements, especially in New York, were kind of like gritty bands called happenings, and that was where the theater would happen all around you, and some of it was scripted and some of it was improvised, and it was meant to be a bit outlaw, a bit dangerous, and a bit like, oh my god, I don't know where this is going. And Velvet Underground shows were very much born out of that idea, that theatrical idea, and that's where the Warhol influence came in. They played with gender, they played with sexuality, they played with all kinds of things. Some of their songs have not aged well because of what's appropriate and not appropriate to say right now. But that's okay, because they never walked that line with malice. They walked it with curiosity and with with a desire to make you feel uncomfortable. Because if you felt uncomfortable, then it meant you needed to think about what your stance was about something. And to me, that's living, breathing art. I loved it. I mean, I could talk about Velvet Underground for days. So
right.
stop me now.
That's rock and roll, right? It's embracing the discomfort. Yeah. It's embracing the discomfort, and it's looking into yourself and thinking, why is this making me uncomfortable? And that is one of the most powerful things that I think music brings to an audience. And yeah, I mean, we could spend a whole episode talking about that. So I don't want to get off track. I want to give you my number 2.
I can't wait.
And because you may or may not have noticed, I'm incredibly indecisive. My top 3 that came from the era was a bit too too narrow of an avenue to go down. So I have 2A and 2B.
Okay. All right. I can get into it. Give it to me.
I think that people don't necessarily group these two together, but I do, so I don't care. I would say you have the Beatles and you have Simon and Garfunkel. And
oh yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, these are 2 bands, and I probably the Beatles to a greater extent if we're being honest, but these are 2 bands that redefined songwriting, that said it doesn't need to be the most complicated thing. I want to make something that people are going to sing along to, that someone who is completely tone deaf and has no musical knowledge could be in the crowd in my concert and be singing their heart out. That whole Abbey Road record, that whole Sound of Silence record. I mean, these are sing-alongs. These are, and when people talk about the Beatles as the greatest band of all time, and that's a whole other discussion, but when people talk about the Beatles as the greatest band of all time, what I think that they're connecting to is these are songs that live in their heads. These are songs that are the soundtracks to their life because they're so memorable in their simplicity, and yet that simplicity is so hard to come by. I mean, to make a song that resonates in the way that these bands did, I don't think it's been done since. The other connection that I saw is these bands really showed that 2 voices can be louder than one and can be more accessible than one. I'm not the biggest fan of Paul Simon or Garfunkel by themselves, but these blends between singers is what made them feel like a sing-along to me, because it almost felt like you were in the concert and you were hearing, these voices around you. You were hearing all these people coming together.
Well, it's very interesting though, because as you were talking, I was thinking, there's so many reasons why they are complementary bands, right? Because they both dealt in deceptive music that seemed to be very simple, but really way more complex than anyone would ever want or be able to articulate.
Mm-hmm.
The beautiful harmonies, the brilliant writing. But what else is really interesting was such beautiful harmonies from people who struggled with their personal relationships with each other. And it's always fascinating to me. It was much less so with the Beatles, but eventually it became the case. But very much so with Simon and Garfunkel, where their ability to blend and harmonize betrayed the fact that for a very long time, they could not reconcile their relationship as friends. And I interviewed Art Garfunkel about a year or 2 before COVID. and every topic was fair game except Paul.
Really?
Yeah.
He said that to you?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And usually the artist doesn't say it, but he said it. Usually the artist as a publicist say, don't ask about whatever.
Oh, so
And he walked in, he goes,
there's still beef there.
there's still a lot of beef there. He walked in and he was like, so we're clear that I'm not here to talk about Paul. And I'm like, yeah, we're clear. He said that in every interview, he did 4 interviews with SiriusXM that day in succession. I was the first one. I didn't have to bring Paul up. He eventually, I'm very good at getting people to say what they don't want to say. And so he wound up bringing up
I've
Paul.
noticed. Thank you very much.
Don't know what you're talking about. But, but the interview that followed me did not play by the rules. Opened with a Paul Simon question, and he took off his headphones and he left the building. And the other 2 hosts who were waiting to interview him were just, the interviews were canceled.
Wow.
And I mean, so there's still a lot of beef there. And you know, I think had John lived, I think John and Paul, the Beatles would have reconciled. But there was a lot of tension there as well. And you know, there's no greater collaboration in life than Paul McCartney and John Lennon. Mm-hmm. Someone disagree with me, I'll fight you. And you know, but they always had tension. You know, one was very sweet and romantic, and one was very mindful of the world and trying to find his place and and a place for his art in it. And they grappled with that. So it's just fascinating to me that these very, tempestuous souls made some of the best music in all of history. Mm-hmm. Very interesting indeed. All right. Well, it's time for my number 1. And, I didn't realize until we were talking that I don't have any like big rock sounds in my top 3. Because my number 1 band from the 60s is the Mamas and the Papas.
All right.
I still obsessively listen to their music. Much like the Crosby, Stills and Nash world, they're kind of part of the same musical world. They came just a little bit before. I would argue that they laid some of the groundwork that allowed Crosby, Stills and Nash to do what they do or did. Beautiful harmonies, great songs, much more classic folk if you go deeper than the hits. But I think the thing that always attracted me to the Mamas and the Papas was that they were basically 4 unattractive losers who found each other and started making music. There was no sex. I mean, well, Michelle Phillips is sort of the sex symbol of the group, but she even in her beauty, there was this odd quirkiness. They kind of were really just average to unattractive, certainly by pop music standards. They were undeniable. Mama Cass Elliot defied the laws of pop music at the time by being an overweight woman and being a pop star. They had romantic tensions before the rumors era Fleetwood Mac even came into imagination, with the romances, the splits, the unrequited love of Cass Elliot and one of the singers, and yet they made some of the most stunning songs you'll ever hear, and for me, their seminal record will always be if you can believe your ears and eyes, or if you can't believe your eyes and ears, from 1966, which had Monday Monday and California Dreamin', and a great version of Spanish Harlem, and I Call Your Name, Straight Shooter. I'm looking at Spotify right now. California Dreamin' has 456 billion streams. Unbelievable. Just one of the most beautiful bands. Ultimately, lots of tragedy in the inner workings of the people.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and I think, as a kid who knew he was not like everybody else, but couldn't identify it, I was drawn to the fact that ultimately the mamas and the papas represented the others in pop music.
Mm-hmm.
They came on stage and they didn't wear fancy clothes, and they were, like I said, they were not a polished pop group, but they made the best music I'd ever heard. So yeah, my number one is the Mamas and Papas.
So Larry, let me ask you, do you see a modern day equivalent to them, or maybe early 2000s or 90s? Like, do you see a band that sort of you could describe in a similar light? Obviously that wouldn't necessarily have the same connection that you had to it.
Yeah, I see bands that have tried it, including the band with one of the daughters of John Phillips, Wilson Phillips. They tried to be that band. I think the country music band Little Big Town has some of that, but they're way more polished and they're a country act, and they kind of work that line between rich, beautiful, folky harmonies and country music and pop music. But no, I don't think there's anyone. I think Little Big Town come the closest. Especially because they also have the very interesting interpersonal relationships in that two of the members are married and all of that. But no, I think Mamas and Papas are one of a kind.
Yeah. All right. So
many imitators, but nobody can match them.
So for my number one, I will admit that I struggled between, do I go with a number one that is purely based on influence, or do I do a number one whose music I connected with the most? And at the end of the day, I decided to err on the side of connection.
Good.
So, my number one band that came about in the 60s is Pink Floyd. So yeah,
very interesting.
Weren't expecting that, were you?
That was not. No, that was. You always surprise me, young Gabriel.
Where do you think I was going?
Always surprise me. I would have bet my rent money that you were going to go for the Stones.
Really? I never actually connected to the Stones really at all, to be honest with you.
See, that's the second countdown we've done, and the second time I was wrong about your number one. I love it. Well, keep me on my toes, mister.
That's what I'm here for.
I know, it's good. I love it.
I mean, Pink Floyd was...
Pink Floyd
is, for me, the perfect combination of not giving a shit and really, really, really giving a shit. And by that,
I mean... so right. You're so right.
Because you have this band that doesn't care about what people are saying in terms of what they can put into their record. If they want to put in a clock clicking down, if they want to put in, footsteps and screaming children in the background of their music, they're going to. They don't care. And yet their music is so incredibly methodical. And I mean, I assume we'll talk about Pink Floyd again when we start talking about the 70s, because that's really when they came to be, that's the Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall. But they took psychedelic rock to new heights, and they with their whole performance was a drug in itself. You could be sober as hell, but if you're listening to that, you're gonna find your mind going, "Ooh," you know what I mean?
It's like the ultimate contact high.
Exactly. It's the ultimate
I love
contact. It's the ultimate contact high, but with really powerful messages. They didn't care what anyone else thought, but they cared so incredibly deeply how they felt about the music, and that is what makes them my number one.
So I never connected to Pink Floyd. They always sort of a bit distant for me. But I got to be honest, the thing that that really hit me most during our conversation today is the way you talked about them. And it's inspired me to go back and listen. And maybe listen with a little bit more maturity. I think I gave up on Pink Floyd as a young person because it was just, I think a lot of it went over my head. I'm, not ashamed to say sometimes I'm not as smart as I wish I was. And I think it just went over my head. So I'm going to go back and give it a listen. I'm one of those guys that sometimes once I decide something, I'm pretty much, that's it. And so I never really went back. Also, someone I really hated in high school really liked them. So I just said, well, if you like them, then I hate them. Very mature. But I'm going to give them another go because it's never too late.
Never too late. That's the beauty of music.
All right. So what's this final surprise you got for me?
So final surprise is something that I'd like to call dream collaborators, or dream collaborations.
Oh, okay.
So I was wondering if you could pick 2 or 3, however many you want, artists from the era that if you were forming your own band or something, or if you were forming a super group, let's say, who would you love to get together?
From the 60s, yeah?
From the 60s.
I would, okay, so can I pick artists who may not be with us in 2022?
Sure.
But who were, okay, good. I love to see crazy groupings. Mm-hmm. So I'd love to see how they what they bring out in each other. So I would love to hear Mama Cass Elliott, one of the greatest perfect voices, in fronting a band with Keith Richards on guitar, and Ray Davies on bass. And see what song, because they were all great songwriters as well, and see what songs they would write. And then just for fun, throw in Keith Moon from The Who.
I love it.
And I think it would be quirky, weird, and I think kind of fabulous, because I think the thing that Mama Cass did not get to do was a real rock record, and I think she would have slayed it. And my dream has always been to hear Ray Davies and Keith Richards play together, and Keith Moon was just one of the greatest drummers ever. So that's mine.
I love it.
What's yours?
I love it.
What's yours?
So I'm gonna go songwriters. I'm gonna take John and Paul, because I don't think anyone has come close to them. Stylistically, I'm going with Pink Floyd, because I love the like I said, I love the floating and the psychedelic. I love all that stuff. And what I would love is to throw in a killer slide solo by Mr. Duane Allman. And I think that you have a powerhouse and you know what? I'll even take it a step further. I want Ginger Baker on the drums, actually.
So fire up that bong. is weed down, baby. But I love it. I love it because it's ethereal, but the Ginger Baker gives it anchor.
It gives it anchor, and I hope that the John and Paul songwriting gives it sing a bit like sing along, but then you also have these just crying almond solos that I think would just fit perfectly with that sort of that Pink Floyd zonked out feeling.
I love it.
Yeah,
that was a fun surprise. I like it.
Yeah, for anyone listening, what are your dream collaborators? If you could wave your magic wand, who from the 60s do you want to see getting together?
Yeah, because I think we're going to be inching closely toward a comment section edition of the comment section podcast.
Yeah,
where everyone has their say. I think I think that's going to be necessary because the best part about reading those parts of any post, whether it be a video post, a story, a blog, whatever, are the things that people say, and how certain things trigger people. And I think we've triggered a lot of people. And I had no idea we were going to. I had no idea it was going to happen, which is all the more fun to me. Because like I've told you off the air all the time, I love a surprise. I love the spontaneity. Don't script me, baby.
Yeah, tell us
all about it. So
tell us why we're wrong. Tell us why we're idiots. Tell us why we're idiots, please.
Yes. And so with that, I'm Larry Flick.
I'm Gabe Scherzer.
And this is the comment section. We'll see you next time.